Hello everybody, Isabella from Prior Attire here, and today we have a slightly different video again, sorry. But one of the most common questions we get asked is how Prior Attire started. Well, it's a complex answer really. Prior Attire as a sole trader or company has existed for the last 16, 17 years I think. And the last 11 years being a full-time costuming company. Now, it hasn't started, I decided to run a costuming company, registered it, and bang, there we are. No, not at all. It is really tricky actually. As a child, yes, I was taught some basic, sewing skills. Very basic sewing skills, so you could sort of, that mostly at school, but also my mother taught me how to use a sewing machine, mostly because being, 80s, so sort of just post-communist regime in Poland, and the joys of socialism, everybody had the same as everybody else, which was not much. So if you wanted to have something that sort of fitted you, just forget about fashionable, something that fitted you, you had to adjust it. So necessity really, not much more. Most of my adjusting, because it was my teenage years, was sort of limited to cropping my tops. I just wanted to show off my belly. So yeah, that was it. Although my mum sort of made me a couple of nice sort of dresses, for both sort of fancy dresses and balls, and for sort of everyday sort of more fancy wear. So I remember a few of these. I'll see if I can find some photos. And she was quite an accomplished dressmaker for exactly the same reasons. Growing up in the 60s and then 70s, you sort of learn how to do stuff. My grandma used to knit a lot. A skill I never really acquired. I tried. I was at school, I was at my grandma. I tried, but it's the counting. I can't do the counting, just forget it. Crochet is fine. But there were sort of generic bits that you know how to use a sewing machine, you know how to repair a curtain, but there was not much into the historical point of view. And I didn't really think that I was interested at all in my teenage years. Most of the time was kung fu and horses and books and native Indians and shooting arrows. But a few years back, just before her death really, my grandma sort of reminded me that I used to draw, mostly ladies, in a historical costume, or very often actually what I thought was a native costume. So I had sort of Slav girls with sort of 12th century blouse. I had Spanish princesses in the Renaissance gear, or inspired by listening to the shogun. I wasn't allowed to watch. Japanese style girls. I completely forgot about that, but yes, actually I remember as a sort of younger child, that was my sort of drawing notebook, that was it basically. So maybe there was something much earlier than I originally had thought. But it was really a background, and I read English in university, and I did not think much of that side of it. I liked history, get on well with it. I liked material history and social history just as well as martial history. And then things changed in, I need to check the year really, but I think it was just before the millennium, when I was visiting London over the summer. My aunt lives here. And I went to the Tower of London. And I think just after my third year, must have been 1897, my third year at studies. I read English at university. And I've just finished a course on historical grammar, amongst other interesting things. So when I went to the medieval tower, in the Tower of London, the medieval palace, sorry, I saw a couple of medieval knights presenting, I think it was games and pastimes of 13th century. Edward, I think. And I just listened more or less to what they were saying. I looked at the artefacts, and there was a little sort of vellum with a poem written on it. And the poem was, I think, 9th century Northumbrian dialect, and I had a look. It was about a fox, and it was quite a cute little thing. So I asked, "Do you mind if I can have a look?" I said, "Yeah, go ahead." I said, "Do you mind if I copy it?" And at that point, those two poor guys just looked at me with blank expression and said, "Can you read it?" I said, "Well, yes." And said, "Can you understand it?" I said, "Well, yes. We ought to have one person who can understand it here. It's Mike." He's like, well, I just had a course. I spent a year learning this stuff, so yeah, don't remember much of it, mind you. But so anyway, struck the conversation. I spent the rest of the day in the medieval palace. Haven't seen much of the tower after on that day. Went for a drink, and these guys were working for Busberry's company, a company run by Matt Wallace and Stephanie Seymour at the time. And they were providing interpreters to Royal Historic Palaces and other places. So that summer really saw the beginning of my adventure into sort of proper historical costuming. Thank you, Mark. So many years ago, I can't believe it. So basically I sort of went along with the actors to, well, I spent a lot of time in the tower, tried out some costumes. Went to other locations. We went to do the Georgian pantiles. That was Tunbridge Wells. We went to Portsmouth, several places, Lewis, Pevensey Castle, a couple of places anyway. I've made friends, and I had a look at what good historical costume looks like. And I think that was the most important thing. I was not introduced to this sort of LARPing, nothing wrong with LARPing per se, but if you're looking for historical accuracy, that might not be the best start. Might be, I don't know. Some works for some people, I suppose. But for me, that was the pivotal point. I saw what good historical costume looks like to start with. So you obviously have to sort of get on with it and try to do something similar if you do it. I went back to the university, and that year I enrolled into a school of historical fencing. And it was a St. George's Brotherhood, but accepted sisters as well. And we basically practiced all kind of fencing. Anything from early medieval sword, later medieval sword, Polish sabres, rapiers, foils, épées, everything went, including some modern fencing, electrical fencing. It was quite fun. So that was the main bit, but they had a Christmas do, and a medieval dress was required. So I sort of asked what sort of medieval we are talking, 1,000 years. I said, just medieval. It's like, could you be more precise? So I sort of dug out into the chronicles about where the original St. George's Brotherhood was formed. That was sort of 14th century, 13th, 14th century. So I made something that, in my opinion, was a brilliant medieval dress, 14th century dress. I got some books. I improvised a pattern, made some weird lacing, and I made the thing. Right, I made the thing. I'll put a photo here. It was crap. It was cotton velvet, it was sort of lyrics trim, but I had veils. I had barbette, I had a fillet, I had a wimple, and it just took everyone. Well, everyone was blown away, and it's like, wow, so different. So I said, actually, I quite enjoyed it. Felt nice. All the wimple, all the boys, that's great. So I started making more, and I started learning a bit more, which at that time, at the beginning, 1988, 1987, was not as easy as it is now. Mostly because internet access, yay. We had computers, we had bits of internet, we had an email. You sort of had to dial up to get the internet going. But obviously not much was on the internet. There were no archives of the museum, so you had to travel, and you had the books. Getting books into Poland was interesting. One of the most staple books I was using, which was quite famous for the whole Poland, was Maria Rychlewska-Gutkowska, History of Costume. It was a book from the 60s, 1960s that is, but it was very comprehensive, and although now we're sort of having learned more, that there are bits that are either lacking, that she did not have access to new information. It was a beautifully presented and beautifully written book, a very comprehensive book of costume in Europe. I still have it. I was really glad to see it referenced in the latest Patterns of Fashion 6. So it's still alive, it still goes. And sort of that was the beginning. You try to source different books, trying to go to museums, look at the portraits, look at what was preserved, look at the sculptures, and just experiment. There was no patterns. Forget about patterns. just forget about patterns. Did not exist. So trial and error. That's how it worked. And I made one dress and then another one and then another one and tried a different century. And obviously in Poland you have Grunwald or Tannenberg battle, which is 1415. So that was most of our sort of medieval stuff, plus early 13th, late 12th century. So these were the two areas that we started with. And gradually my interest sort of broadened up a little bit more. I started going to the Forteviken market at Viking market in Forteviken in Sweden. But I also made friends and started going to tournaments, as they were called at the time. Not balls exactly, just different events. Either doing shows with sword fighting, or as a lady, or doing some dancing. So all those kind of activities sort of required more costumes. Yes, you guessed. Unfortunately, being a student on a budget, let us say, well, the fabrics were not correct. And very often weird fabrics were utilised, found in charity shops or in grandma's cupboard. I had a dress made out of my grandma's tablecloths. That was sort of 12th century-ish frock. I had a dress made out of curtains. That was my 17th century work, IKEA curtains. And the dress that was sort of weird cotton, I think. That was one of my first ones. So yes, we sort of experiment and learn. And as I started experimenting more and more, other people asked me to make stuff for them. And it was a bit, not really sure. But then they're paying. Poor student, that will pay for my fabric. I can upgrade my game. Fantastic. And that's basically how it really started. The marketing was word of mouth. People saw what you were wearing at the events. They came over to you. Where did you get it? You made it fantastic. Please make me one. But slowly I sort of drifted out of the Brotherhood of St. George after about 7 years, I think, or so. Mostly because we had different ideas for historical adequacy and accuracy. And I started hanging out with folks from Warsaw and Krakow. And then was when I really sort of get my game up. Formed a little company, well, not really company, sort of again, an official company specialising in medieval clothing with my then boyfriend. It was called Manufaktura Wyzimska. Hello, Sapkowski reference. And we provided basically clothing for quite a lot of people in Poland and abroad. So I built quite a clientele. Again, slowly my interest sort of fanned out a bit more. I started experimenting with Elizabethan and Tudor costume as well as 17th century, which is quite a big thing in Poland in the 17th century. Had lots of battles, lots of interesting histories going on at that time. Something I would like to really revisit at some point. But then I moved to London. I had a boyfriend in London who really wanted me to come over. He was one of the Vikings. I was quite reluctant, but agreed. Poland just sort of joined the union, so I could. And although the relationship did not last long, romantically at least, we were still sort of friends, it sort of interrupted the flow, so I immigrated to England with 2 suitcases and a bow and arrows. That was my baggage over on a plane. And for a couple of years, all I could do was basically just work at the college when I was working at the time and just eke out my living as much as I could. And slowly, I started to pick up the threads of my interest in business as well. Started doing some lace making, and then I've heard about a festival in York, the Viking Festival in York, so why not? Went to York, met more friends, made more contacts, and then met people from the 17th century here, which is English Civil War Society. And that time we already had internet, so I sort of Googled them. I already knew the officer there, and I wrote with them for about 8 years as well, in a cavalry unit, which was great fun. Battles were great fun. I was not so keen on the social aspect. I'm an introvert, so being on a horse, shooting a carbine and trying, pretending to clop people over the head with a blood sword, that was great fun. But beer tents and when people are drunk and you're not really much fun. Just not my thing. And sitting in a plastic tent wasn't my thing either. So it sort of petered out after some time due to different factors, really. I'm still looking very much fondly back on my experiences there, and a cracking regiment to be with. I had a brilliant time over the field, and I've learned a lot about 17th century costume in England. There you go. And at that point I started selling some bits on Etsy. Again, as a poor teacher at that time, not a poor student anymore, but college teachers did not really earn that much, still don't do, unfortunately. I had to sort of get a little bit more of income, so that was the next bit. But usually I started with medieval stuff, and obviously in England you've got the War of the Roses, so it's the later part, the later part of the 15th century when where people basically wore medieval garb. Not the early one like in Poland, but the latter ones. So it was more learning, more visiting different places, and browsing online catalogues and museums. It was great. It was absolutely fantastic. And made more friends, and slowly sort of set up a company called Prior Attire, and ran it for several years alongside my business, my teaching career. And although I enjoyed teaching and enjoying sort of influencing life of other people in a hopefully positive way, giving them tools to live in this country after English as a second language, slowly the bureaucracy was sort of getting me down. And at some point the funding sort of got cut completely for ESOL. So I was forced to into a position of teaching something else or changing careers. At that point I was already on part-time teaching. Sort of throughout several years I went through 0.9, then 0.8, then 0.75, and that year I was on 0.5 already, teaching 2.5 days, and the rest of the time was basically commissions and stock items for Etsy, working as a Prior Attire. I think that transition point is really important if you're starting a business on your own and you have no one else to provide a security behind you. No wealthy parents or family. You can't just leave your job and start doing stuff. You have to pay your bills, you have to pay my rent, I have to buy cat food. So that sort of took 5 years of gradually reducing my college hours and building up my costuming bits. And all the time learning and studying. Basically, all the money I got from my business went straight back into the business, and it still goes most of the time. It's an investment, and it's still building, and it's building, and it's growing in a way and changing. So that's the important bit. And at some point, when I was just taught you have to teach home economics to youth offenders, or computing to 18 years or 16, 18 years old, and it's like, I know nothing about those things. And I resigned and advertised that we're now full-time, open for commissions, and without 24 hours I was booked for another year. So that was a good start, and it sort of continued, and you sort of adapt your notion of what your business is, and I've changed my business a lot over the last 10 years. And obviously pandemic didn't really help, and that's another factor of how to adapt. I'm thinking of doing a series of shortish videos on running a historical, or at least costuming business, but obviously the premises can be applied to other craft or art-based businesses as well, if that is of any interest to you guys. please let me know in the comments if that is something that you would like to see as a content. Basically, you know, how it worked for me, why some things worked out, why some things did not work out, what practices are employed to achieve my targets and my aims, and what, I suppose that's what practices you can employ to make your business better. Obviously it doesn't work for everybody. This is something that worked for me personally, but that might be something that is useful to everybody else. So please let me know in the comments, and if there's enough interest, I'll get on it and sort it out. I'll try to put some more photos at the end of this little slideshow for my beginners costumes for you to have a bit of a laugh. It's really interesting to look back at them, because you sort of gone so far away, but at the same time you realise that another 10 years on I will be laughing at the costumes I'm making now. so it's a bit of a sobering thought. So yes, I think that's all I wanted to say. So enjoy the little trip back in time, and let me know whether you would like some content on how to run a historical or costuming business. Thank you. Oh my goodness, guys, I found a whole old album full of old reenactment photos. So this was one of my first dresses, the one in cotton velvet with sort of rayon trim. I still have the crispy net and I still use it. Made on soutache, plastic pearls, but worked. And my first cotardie, that's in the later years, obviously with a very sexy armoured leg. Let's see what else we have here. More cotardie and 14th century fun. Hey, my first Burgundian. Not my first Burgundian, my second Burgundian, much better than the first one. This one actually had a kirtle underneath. It's all made in wool. And my first venture into Elizabethan. Yes, it was very much a furnishing velvet and cotton velvet affair. 17th century wool. Used that for several years. Was all hand stitched. And more 17th century stuff. Oh, good grief, cotton velvet galore. Such a milady, eh? And one of my first houppelons. Also cotton velvet and not lined with artificial pearl buttons. 18th century IKEA cotton skirt, modern waistcoat I think. Had made up to be a tricorn, and here with a jacket that I've made for some fencing displays, paired with the same skirt. And the first venture into Victorian, made out of the same medieval dress you saw in the beginning, modern velvet jacket, or the vintage velvet jacket, and the curtains, and sort of worked for a photo shoot at least, didn't wear it anywhere else. That was my first surcoat. Good grief. Cold. That's about it, I think.